Have you ever wondered why the witches and wizards of New are so weak? The Hogwarts founders from the 10th century were supposed to have been 4 of the most skilled witches and wizards that the magical world had ever seen, with proof of this being the impressive magical institution they left behind. Then of course there's Merlin, another 10th century wizard that is supposed to have been the most powerful wizard of all time, and was aptly named the Prince of Enchanters. And a few centuries after that came the Peverell brothers, a trio of brothers who, in Dumbledore's own words, were gifted, dangerous wizards who succeeded in creating those powerful objects. Those objects, of course, being the fabled Deathly Hallows. And in the 14th century, along came Nicolas Flamel, who made wizarding history by creating perhaps the most powerful magical object of all time, the Philosopher's Stone. When people talk about witches and wizards of the past, it's as though they were so powerful that they are entirely uncomparable to most modern-day witches and wizards. In the modern era, we've got powerful wizards like Voldemort and Dumbledore, but they sort of seem like exceptions to the rule. It doesn't seem like they're true outliers, but instead that they more or less represent the level of power that wizards should have, or perhaps once had. So my question is, what happened? Why are witches and wizards so much weaker than they were in centuries prior? Is it all the butterbeer? Today we're going to be exploring all of that and more as we peel back the layers of wizarding history and uncover where all of that raw power went. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. I believe that the key to understanding the depreciating levels of power among wizard kind directly correlates to a dark secret in wizarding history. Hear me out. In the current era, there exists a definitive line separating Muggle from magical, and it probably won't surprise you to hear that this current landscape came as a direct result of conflict between the two worlds. But what you may not know is that for centuries, witches and wizards lived among Muggles, and would even use their abilities to help their non-magical friends and neighbours in need. Presumably, much of the magic that was performed during this time was done for medicinal needs, to help cure illness, prevent outbreaks of disease, or heal injuries. And while I'm sure dark magic existed and was wielded by some witches and wizards against Muggles, for the most part, there was no ill will between the two communities. But then, in the late 1700s, witches and wizards went into hiding. Why? Because for the past couple of centuries, Muggles had begun to hunt down those with magical abilities, accusing them of worshipping the devil and participating in sinful activities, before ultimately putting them on trial and condemning many of them to death. The first witch hunts began in the early 1300s throughout various European communities, before spreading rampantly across the globe and culminating in the American town of Salem in the 1690s. Over the course of 400 years or so, it's estimated that about 110,000 people were tried for witchcraft, with somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people convicted and then executed for these crimes. Dumbledore's notes in his copy of Wizard and the Hopping Pot references the environment at the time. The persecution of witches and wizards was gathering pace all over Europe in the early 15th century. Many in the magical community felt, and with good reason, that offering to cast a spell on the Muggle next door's sickly pig was tantamount to volunteering to fetch the firewood for one's own funeral pyre. "Let the Muggles manage without us," was the cry, as the wizards drew further and further apart from their non-magical brethren. In response to the increasingly hostile environment, significant portions of the wizarding populace were forced to start living double lives, using concealment charms to protect themselves. And eventually, in an effort to preserve their magical existence, they began to establish hidden communities within Muggle villages. As the witch hunts grew ever fiercer, wizarding families began to live double lives, using charms of concealment to protect themselves and their families. By the 17th century, any witch or wizard who chose to fraternize with Muggles became suspect, even an outcast in his or her own community. And we're led to believe that this is what catalyzed the creation of the International Statute of Secrecy, a protective measure that has enabled wizarding society to remain in relative peace for centuries. This law, first signed in 1689 and officially ratified in 1692, was created to conceal the existence of witches and wizards from the Muggle population. It was designed to safeguard the magical world through the implementation of strict secrecy measures, preventing Muggles from discovering the existence of the wizarding community and their magical abilities. But I'm not so sure that the history books are telling the full story. I think that there's a lot more to this divide between the two worlds than we're led to believe. While the history books paint a picture of wizardkind being the bigger person after years of conflict and subsequently disappearing into the shadows, I'm not so sure they had much of a choice in the matter. I don't truly believe that wizards just up and left voluntarily. By the late 17th century, Muggle and wizard conflicts had hit an all-time high, with plenty of bloodshed and casualties on both sides. And it's these escalating tensions and violence that created a precarious and volatile environment, with both communities vying for power and control. The brutal clashes and devastating consequences of these conflicts had pushed the magical community to the brink, leading to a deep-seated fear of persecution and annihilation at the hands of the Muggles. This is when witches and wizards started going into hiding and living double lives. However, the unchecked power and advancements of the Muggles had become a formidable threat to the magical world, and the wizards found themselves in a disadvantaged position, fighting to preserve their way of life and protect their kind. And I suspect that the overwhelming influence and resources of the Muggles may have eventually left the magical community without any more options. At this stage, wizardkind had lost their most powerful defenders at the hands of Muggle forces, which would explain why there's such an absence of powerful figures in the modern era. The more powerful and talented bloodlines were simply killed off. And I think that eventually, in the war between Muggles and wizards, Muggles actually won. It's not that the wizards wanted to go into hiding, they were forced there, and I suspect that the International Statute of Secrecy was never a voluntary choice made by wizards, but in actuality a measure forced upon them by the dominant power of the non-magical world. And it certainly wouldn't have been the only Muggle-made decision that was implemented. Prior to 1707, the Wizards' Council was the longest-serving body to govern the magical community in Britain, but after the imposition of the International Statute of Secrecy in 1692, the wizarding community suddenly decided that they needed a more highly structured, organized, and more complex governing structure than they had hitherto used, to support, regulate, and communicate with a community in hiding. This is when the Ministry of Magic was formed, and it all sort of sounds like something that the Muggles would have orchestrated in order to A. further establish control, B. ensure that wizards stay out of the Muggle world under the guise of keeping wizards safe, and C. suppress magical power. Wizards' Council sounds like the name of a self-contained magical government, but Ministry of Magic sort of just sounds like a sub-department of something larger, like, the Muggle government. There are also some clues in the book which could suggest that the Ministry actually answers to the Muggle government. In the fourth book, it's revealed that the Minister of Magic was required to tell the Prime Minister that he was bringing a dangerous magical creature into the country, a dragon. But this level of correspondence seems unusual and oddly accommodating for a magical government that was literally forced into hiding in order to stay alive. I can't imagine why they would have these sorts of self-imposed rules, unless that rule was put in place by the Muggles. The whole goal of the Ministry of Magic, besides introducing some level of law and order, is ensuring that the International Statute of Secrecy is maintained. But I don't think that we're looking at it from the right perspective. We are led to believe that they are upholding the International Statute of Secrecy to stay hidden from Muggles and protect wizardkind. The whole Ministry of Magic is based around this. But I think that the Ministry is actually a Muggle-made and controlled department with a few primary goals: keep wizards away from Muggles and keep them hidden away in the shadows. In essence, these two perspectives share the same goal, but the main differentiator here is how wizards perceive themselves. In one scenario, wizards are looking out for themselves and doing what they believe is best for their species. But in the other, wizardkind is a subjugated group that lost a war and is now being manipulated into hiding itself. The entire government is actually a clever plan to make wizards believe they are doing this to themselves. And after centuries of living under this bureaucracy, its policies have become part of the very culture of magic. The subtle manipulation and control exerted through the government, education system, and legal frameworks have served to perpetuate a sense of self-regulation and compliance among wizard kind. By fostering the illusion of agency and autonomy within the magical community, the governing bodies have effectively maintained their dominance and influence over the fate of wizards and witches. The seamless integration of these structures into the fabric of magical society has obscured the true extent of external influence and manipulation exerted by the Muggles. As generations have passed under the guise of self-governance, the mechanisms of control have become so deeply entrenched that many within the magical community may not even question the underlying motives and power dynamics at play. The normalization of subjugation and compliance has perpetuated a cycle of obedience and conformity, further cementing the hegemonic control of the Muggle authorities over the magical world. As for the noticeable lack of powerful wizarding figures in the modern era, well, I think this governmental structure partially helps to answer that as well. While the most powerful bloodlines may have been lost protecting their kind during the peak of the war, I suspect that subsequent subjugation from the prevailing Muggles has made sure that no witches and wizards achieve that level of power again. By controlling the government, educational system, laws, etc., I suspect that they would be able to suppress the magical community's power quite effectively. It's hard to believe that the two worlds could ever truly separate, especially if we consider how intertwined they once were, and this could possibly be an answer as to how true separation was finally achieved. What do you think? Is this theory as ridiculous as Hagrid wearing a tie, or am I possibly onto something? Feel free to poke holes in this one, as I know it's not the most ironclad. It was just fun to theorize on. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live